We are now on resource controls. There are different systems for optimizing virtual machine resource used. Those managed by the kernel, those configured by the virtual machine creator, and those which are adjustable by the administrator. Now, we've already talked about hyper-threading and load balancing and transparent page sharing and balloon drivers and memory compression and swap files. That's all handled by the VM kernel. And furthermore, the virtual machine creator can always assign more RAM to make a computer run faster. But a third category of optimization is that which is adjustable by the administrator, and that's what we're going to discuss in this section. We are going to discuss limits, reservations, and share allocations for CPUs and for RAM. So let's start out with resource allocation. The resources that we are going to allocate will be CPU and memory resources. And the methods of allocating those resources are using shares, using reservations, and using limits. So let's start out with a resource allocation example. In this example, the host computer, ESXi host, has 8 CPUs. One virtual machine is assigned 4 CPUs. The other virtual machine is assigned 4 CPUs. There's no resource conflict. There is no problem. However, a resource conflict, an example of a resource conflict, would be the ESXi host has 8 CPUs, and there are 3 virtual machines. Each virtual machine has been assigned 4 CPUs. That's 12 CPUs. That's more virtual CPUs assigned than there really are in the ESXi host. So if that happens, by default, they will all get equal priority. That's something the hypervisor does, load balancing. But what if we don't want them to get equal priority? What if we want the customer application to get 50% of CPU utilization, and then the employee file server and the test server each to get only 25% of utilization? To achieve that, we allocate shares. Now, the definition of a share in business is a part ownership of the business, and in virtualization, it means a part ownership of the resources. It does not mean a shared folder as you would share a folder in Windows 7 or Windows Server. So what we do is we assign a greater proportionate number of shares to the application that we want to have more CPU utilization. So what we will do is we will give half of all the shares to the first virtual machine, and then a quarter of the shares to the second virtual machine, and a quarter of the shares to the third virtual machine. That way the first virtual machine will get 50% of all ESXi CPU resources. So here's how we do it. We log in, and I'll go to the first virtual machine, the customer application server, and I'll right click and I will select settings. Then I will select the tab that says resources, and to allocate resources, I allocate shares. I select the drop down, and under custom shares, I will assign 2,000 shares to this virtual machine. The default number of shares is simply 1,000, but I'm going to change it to 2,000. So now this virtual machine has more shares. I'll go to the second virtual machine, right click, edit settings, and I can see it's already set to normal, so it has 1,000 shares. And then I look at the next virtual machine, and it also has 1,000 shares because that's the default. So what we've done is we've assigned 2,000 shares to the first virtual machine, and then 1,000 shares to the second virtual machine, and 1,000 shares to the third virtual machine. And what that is going to do is to give the first virtual machine 50% of all CPU resources on that ESXi host. This is called assigning shares. When we allocate shares, just to restate the definition, in business, a share is a part ownership of a business, and in virtualization, it is a higher or lower priority. But remember, shares in VMware are not a shared folder as they would be in Windows 7. Allocating resources at different levels. You can configure shares per virtual machine, and that's what we did. But if you have a large number of virtual machines, you might want to use resource pools and group the virtual machines into the resource pools. So this takes us to the section on resource pools. What is a resource pool? Resource pools can be used to hierarchically partition available CPU and memory resources of a standalone host or cluster. Resource pool attributes. Resource pool attributes consist of shares, which can be low, high, normal, or custom. Reservations, which can be set in megahertz or megabytes. And limitations. And these variables can be set per CPU, and they can be set on the memory. So let's just review what we said about shares in the previous section. Let's assign shares per virtual machine. So if this virtual machine gets 1,000 CPU shares, and if this virtual machine gets 1,000 CPU shares, then this one gets double the amount of resources of this one. Okay, but what if we have a large number of virtual machines? Then we use resource pools. So here's the example. We've got 4 different virtual machines in 2 different departments, and one department has higher priority. So we will give one department higher priority, and then within each department, the virtual machines will have different priorities. So we will start out with 2 resource pools, the engineering pool and the finance pool. And the finance pool will be given 2,000 shares, and the engineering pool will be given 1,000 shares. So finance pool gets 2/3 of all shares, and the engineering pool gets 1/3 of all shares. And then within each one of those pools, we add a virtual machine. In the engineering pool, we create an engineering test virtual machine and an engineering production virtual machine. And the engineering test virtual machine has 1,000 shares within that pool, and the production virtual machine has only 2,000 shares. So this virtual machine has only 1,000 shares in a pool, which only has 1,000 shares. And then in the finance pool, we have 2 virtual machines. The production virtual machine has 2,000 of the shares in the finance pool, and the finance test virtual machine has 1,000 of the shares in the finance pool. So the production virtual machine has 2/3 of the shares in the finance pool, which has 2/3 of all CPU utilization. And the engineering test virtual machine has 1/3 of the shares in the engineering pool, which has 1/3 of the shares on the entire ESX host. So to look at it another way, the engineering virtual machine gets 1/3 of 1/3. So the engineering virtual machine only gets 11% of all resources, whereas the production finance virtual machine gets 2/3 of 2/3. So the finance virtual machine gets 67% of all CPU resources in that ESXi host. Let's do another example of assigning shares to resource pools. What we can do if we can give the first resource pool 2/3 of the shares and the second resource pool 1/3 of the shares. So, and if we assign 8,000 shares to the first virtual machine, 4,000 shares to the second virtual machine, that will be a 2-to-1 ratio. So let's do it. I'll go to the ESXi host, right click, select new resource pool, and I will simply name it Resource Pool 1. And then I will add these two, drag and drop these applications and put them in Resource Pool 1. Then I will right click and create a second resource pool, and I will call it Resource Pool 2, followed by OK. And then I can put some virtual machines in Resource Pool 2. Then I will go back to Resource Pool 1, and under Settings, what I will do is I will give it high utilization. So I am giving this this resource pool 8,000, or 2/3 of all resources in the entire ESXi host. If I go to pool number 2 and select Edit Settings, I am just going to leave that resource pool at 4,000 shares. So what we see is that the first resource pool gets 2/3 of all resources on the entire ESXi host, and the second pool gets 1/3 of resources on the entire ESXi host. The first pool gets 1/3 of the resources, and the second pool gets 2/3 of the resources. And the engineering virtual machine, if it gets 1/3 of the engineering pool, which is 1/3 of all CPU resources, then the engineering pool gets 1/3 of 1/3. The engineering test gets 1/3 of 1/3, which is only going to be 11%. Now let's discuss reservations. If there are many virtual machines running, the purpose of a reservation is to guarantee a minimum amount of CPU utilization to a particular virtual machine. So here's what I do. I select my virtual machine 1, and I right click and I select Edit Settings, and under Resources, Reservations is not configured to anything right now. Now, if I slide reservations to the far right, I could reserve all of the memory or all of the CPU resources in the entire ESXi host for that virtual machine, but there wouldn't be any left for anybody else. So I will just slide it back and specify that at least 1 megahertz, which is one virtual CPU, will be 1,000 megahertz will be available to this virtual machine. So when it powers on, it'll have at least 1,000 megahertz of processor utilization guaranteed to it. That's what a reservation is for. Reservation guarantees a minimum amount of processor time to a virtual machine. Now let's discuss limitations. An application or a virtual machine which takes an excessive amount of memory or an excessive amount of CPU utilization is called a resource hog. A resource hog. And this is why we have limitations. Limitations prevent one virtual machine from gobbling up all of the memory so nobody else has any. Limitations put a limit on how much memory or CPU utilization can be used by a virtual machine. So here's the example. I will right click on this virtual machine and select Edit Settings. And right now there is no limit. So if I clear the checkbox on limit and I set it to, for example, 4,000 megahertz, then that guarantees 4 virtual CPUs, or I should say it limits this virtual machine to only using 4 virtual CPUs and no more. The purpose of the limits is to prevent one virtual machine from consuming all of the CPU or all of the memory resources. In summary, reservations guarantee resources for a virtual machine. Limitations prevent a virtual machine from using all of the resources, and shares are used to, when there are insufficient resources, to distribute the resources among virtual machines, particularly if you want one virtual machine to have a greater degree of shares. These variables can be configured on CPU. They can be configured on memory. They can be configured per virtual machine, and they can be configured per resource pool. And this concludes our section on resource